Very interesting. Take a look at that. All right. Welcome, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. We are close to the end of a section, but it was just getting too late to finish it last time. So we don't like stopping in the middle. We like to find good points to stop at. So what we're going to try to do is finish up this section that we're at now and go into chapter 4 and find a good place to stop. I have an idea where I'd like to get to, but I don't want to pressure myself or anyone else, and we'll just take it as it comes. Okay. I believe we're on page 77, the interpersonal intellectual realm, justice. Okay. So we said that basically there is personal, which means between the individual and Hashem, God. And then there's the interpersonal, between man and his fellow man. And within the personal, interpersonal, there are different parts, like the bodily ones, intellectual. So now we're going to discuss the interpersonal intellectual realm, which is justice. Towards the top of page 77, if you are looking inside, the theory and practice of universal ethics, the Noahide laws, by Rabbi Dr. Shimon Dovid Cowen of Australia. All right. The Noahide law of theft and material harm requires mutual acknowledgement of the material entitlement of one another. The Noahide law of justice applies the same balance in the realm of reason applied to the opposing claims and arguments of persons engaged in legal conflict. Justice signifies the objective and impartial evaluation of the claims of others. It guards against intellectual partiality in assessing the rights and wrongs of other persons. Basically, you have a judicial system and you have a judge or judges, or as they call it, a jury. And ideally, they are to be impartial and they're to hear the arguments, and each side, whether they themselves or they hire a lawyer or whatever you want to call the legal representative, they hire the individual, and he is supposed to argue in the person's favor, and you try to make your claim and explain your position, why you are right and the other person, your opposition, is wrong. And then they do the same. So the question is, where does the truth lie in a sense of justice? Who's right, who's wrong? Or is there some middle ground where everybody is a little bit right and a little bit wrong, or to what degree, etc.? So you have merits in your argument, and so does the other person, oftentimes. So you need to have someone who can intellectually judge the case without being subjective, or they have to be impartial. This operates in the critical and impartial gathering of evidence, the dispassionate judgment of the evidence and determination of punishment which fairly matches the crime, the degree of responsibility of its perpetrator, and the social need for deterrence, as discussed in chapter 10. It is marked by a thinking which excludes the eruption of a particular interest or bias in judgment, or would lead to the parties to justice being treated unequally or with partiality. Okay, so that's really how the system is supposed to work. The perversion of justice is the arbitrary working of adjunctive processes through fear or favor of persons and interests. Though its outcomes are concrete, injustice is essentially a perversion of reason applied to interpersonal relations. In other words, sometimes the judge might be afraid of one of the parties being a thug or bully or associated with whatever groups of thugs there you may have. Could be gang, who knows what, or it may be that the person is related to or has strong connections to one of the parties. Now, in any of those cases, or for any of those reasons, the way that it works is your mind can actually go in a certain direction, and you can intellectually understand something and explain it, and at times not even mean to be unfair. And in fact, the person is partial, and therefore it may be intellectually correct or have merit to it intellectually, but it is not justice. It is an injustice. A classical example would be bribery. It is forbidden to take a bribe, even to judge correctly. If the judge sees that this party is right and that party is wrong, and they're almost at that point where they're ready to issue the verdict, not only can they not take a bribe to rule incorrectly, it's a prohibition to accept the bribe, even to rule in what the judge thinks is correct. And the reason is because once a person took a bribe, human nature is such that they are partial, and therefore they're stuck. And it is impossible for them to be able to give a fair ruling. They may say the right thing, they may be fair, but there's no guarantee any longer. And I'm going to give you a very extreme case just to show you how important it is and how bribery can affect anyone. In the Torah, in the Bible, so there was an episode with the daughters of an individual named Tzlafchad, the 5 daughters of Tzlafchad. Tzlafchad had no sons. He had daughters, very, very wise daughters, and very righteous. When it came time to divide up the land of Israel, while they were still in the wilderness with Moshe, with Moses, and each person would get the inheritance according to their tribe. You had to have a tribunal affiliation. And then there's all the laws of how it works according to the Torah for the Jewish people to inherit land in the land of Israel. Well, one of the rules is that the sons are the heirs. The oldest son, firstborn, getting a double portion, and the other one's getting a regular portion. So in other words, if there's 3 sons, you divide it into quarters, and the oldest one gets half, and the second one gets 1/4, and the third one gets 1/4. If there are no sons, if a man died childless, so then it depends if his father is still living, the deceased, and if not, then his brothers, and then there's a whole system. And everybody has a relative, unless the person is a ger tzedek, a convert, then he has no Jewish relatives. But otherwise, as long as the person's a born Jew, they have relatives. It may be a 3rd cousin, a 4th cousin. You have to have some relatives. Okay. Now, the story was Tzlafchad had passed away without any sons, just a bunch of daughters. They came to demand that they should get a fair share in the land. And when they came to Moses towards the end of the 40 years in the desert with this argument, with this claim, as they were presenting their case and identifying who they are, they said, our father died. And the way they said it was that he died for his own sin. He was not amongst the assembled, amongst the group of rebels of Koirach. Okay, that was a whole episode. You may remember when a cousin of Moses and Aaron basically rebelled against Moses and Aaron, and he gathered 250 of the great leaders with him. And that was a very sad, tragic story, how it was the first earthquake in world history, and it swallowed them up, and so forth. So they said, the way they presented themselves and identified who their father was, he was from the tribe of Menashe, and he died without any sons. And they said he died for his own sins and he wasn't part of the Kairach story. As soon as they said that, Moses excused himself from being able to judge their case. He canceled, he disqualified himself as the judge. Why? Because he felt that there was some type of bribery, if you will, because they mentioned something that happened nearly 40 years ago, and they said their father was not part of the revolt against Moses. Now you have to understand, Moses was so great, and he was the most humble man ever, as it says in the Torah. God told him to write that in the Torah, that the man Moses was the most humble. And furthermore, it was nearly 40 years later. By now, if anybody had any feelings, I think they kind of got over it. And yet, because they made that statement of identifying themselves as the daughter of a man who was not part of the group that was challenging Moses' authority, boom, he disqualified himself. How much more so a person who's not on the level of Moses, just a regular judge, has to be super careful. And then there are many examples given in the Talmud of how a person would do something for the judge, which was not bribery, but because it was some kind of a favor, he disqualified himself. One of them, I think, is the case where he had someone working for him, a sharecropper or something, which is fine. You're allowed to judge someone who works for you and you pay him, as long as that's not the case that you're judging. However, during the case, or just before the case was going to begin, the person brought the produce to the judge one day early. Let's say normally they would bring the produce on Friday, and this particular time they brought it on Thursday. See, it belongs to him. It's the judge's produce. But because the person brought it one day early, he disqualified himself, said, forget it, I can't judge your case. Because you did me a favor. What kind of favor? It's his. You did something a little bit different than usual. Okay. Now, the interpersonal unitary realm prohibited killing. The transgression of killing, whether in murder and manslaughter, euthanasia, unwarranted abortion, or suicide, all of those are in the category of murder, relates to the unitary person in the realm of interpersonal relationships. Because the object of killing is to destroy another unitary, that is, a whole living and souled person. Even though we also mentioned suicide, which is not the other person, but let's put that on the side for the moment. But it is also a crime of the whole essential person, one which implicates the soul of the perpetrator. For just as blasphemy blemishes the soul of the perpetrator of blasphemy, which knows God and yet rebels against him, so murder strikes also at God. This is so in two senses. Why is killing another human being a sin against God per se? First, unlike personal property, which a person can renounce, life is the possession of God alone. Only God can take it or authorize its taking, whether in a person's defense of him or herself or another, and other special circumstances. In killing unlawfully, one strikes God's property. So in other words, if I own property, I legally can denounce my ownership. And in Jewish terms, in the Torah law, the word for it is hefker. The Hebrew word is hefker, which means to make my property ownerless, up for grabs. Like the kids like to, they throw something up for grabs, down for keeps. So legally, one can make something first come, first serve, and no one has to pay for it. First guy who grabs it, it's theirs. I can do that with my property. Okay? Whether it's a movable object, whether it's livestock, or whether it's real estate, a house, a field, person can legally give up ownership willingly. Not so with life. One is not a master or ruler over the right to live of oneself or anyone else. Secondly, the highest composite identity, the soul of the living human being, is stamped with a divine likeness. One who kills unlawfully strikes at this divine likeness. So the second reason why killing is a sin against God is because, as we said, man is made in the image of God, and especially the spiritual energy, which is the life force, which we call the soul, that is in the divine likeness. So if a person decides to separate that soul from the body, they are, in fact, fighting against God himself. So that's why killing is not only a sin between man and their fellow man, for two reasons, as we just said. Killing is also an attack upon the divine intention that the world be settled and not destroyed, which is a very general thing that we use when it comes to Noahide laws. Many commandments or many things fall into that category. It's the general statement, the way the prophet says it, that the world was not created for chaos, for toyu, but rather lisheves yitzara, to make it settled and to make it civilized. So killing is pretty much going against having a civil, settled world. Whilst this is true of transgression of any of the Noahide laws, which all serve the civilized habitation of the world, with killing, one has destroyed the inhabitant. So it's like more direct than any of the others. In killing a person, where there was no warrant based on self-defense, etc., one is, in the words of the tradition, as though one has destroyed an entire world. Because after all, the way the Mishnah puts it in the Talmud, the entire world came from one person, from one company. All of the countless billions and billions of people that have been around since the creation of the world thousands of years ago, all come from Adam and Eve, which means to say, potentially, any one individual can have an entire world come from them. So when a person kills one person, it is to be considered as if they killed not one person, not many people, but an entire world. For this was the purpose of creation, that it be cultivated, settled, and civilized by human beings, and ultimately be made a residence for revealing godliness. Adam, the first human, was created alone, simply to heighten the importance and centrality to creation of every single individual. So we should all view every human being like Adam. When a person is destroyed, the very purpose of creation, brought into being for the sake of the service of that person, is vitiated. This is something known by the soul, which is deeply blemished in the person of a killer. Positively put, the intention of this Noahide law is, wherever possible, to protect life, one's own and another's highest self, the living soul, and to save it. This life symbolizes the divine quality within an agency of the human being in the world and the rationale of its and the human being's creation. And anyone who preserves one person in the world is considered as having preserved the entire world. So in other words, in the positive sense, if you save one life, it's as if you saved an entire world. So it goes both ways. Now, we may not understand and appreciate the quality of life. See, if you go only with logic, so you may come to certain conclusions are not in sync with God's will, with God's commandments of the Noahide laws. For example, ethically speaking, there are all sorts of decisions that have to be made. These are things which happen daily. If there is a choice to save two people, you could only save one or the other. And the doctor, the medic, whatever the situation is, can only save one, and they have to make a choice. So what are the calculations one would make? So you'd think logically, the younger person has more years to live than the older person. Or the person who contributes more to society than the other. Or the person who's less of a burden on society. Like, why should we have this person be hooked up to machines and use up taxpayers' money just to barely be alive and go on like this for as many months or years that they will, when the other person has a better chance of a full recovery? So there's all sorts of calculations that come into the picture. And it's a matter of ethics. We have to have the Torah guide us as far as these decision makings. Some of those things do play, and oftentimes they don't. It's misguided logic because you're only using your rational logic and you're leaving out the bigger picture. For example, the whole question about prolonging a person's life when they're basically hooked up to machines. And like, what's that? What kind of life is it? It's not much of a quality of life. And many people, unfortunately, they even say to the person who is going to be making the decisions when they're unable to or whatever, legally, they tell them that don't let me suffer or don't prolong my life, or once I get to a certain point where I will be so limited or not really functional, I don't want that kind of a life, and don't do anything. And of course, people, when they come to the hospital, they have to sign this waiver, that waiver, whatever it is. There's a lot of legalities to that. And it's understandable, especially if a person witnessed others suffering like that, they don't want to go through that. But that's not always our right to make those decisions. Then one can ask, a philosophical question. What's the point and what's the purpose? What does God gain by having a soul stuck in a body as a vegetable for years? There are people that live like that for years. What are they doing? There's like no gain. Nobody gains anything. And besides the various explanations and reasons that can be given, I think that it's important that step number one is that we don't know and we don't need to understand. What we need to know is that there's value to life beyond our interpretation and our understanding. The fact that this person is alive, physically alive, soul in the body, that's what God wants. That's number one. Then there are actual explanations and reasons that can be given, which right offhand I could think of a few, but I'm not going to go into that right now. All right, now that brings us to chapter 4. But being that it is close to time for us to take questions and comments. So what I'm going to do is as follows. We're going to open up now for your comments, and depending on how much time we have left, I think we'll then go on to chapter 4, unless we get into a whole discussion, and then we'll just stop here. Anybody have anything they want to add or ask or comment on what we just said? Go ahead.
Aaron.
Okay, so I'm thinking about how in our country here, the court has been used to do certain types of things. And I'm wondering, as a Noahide, how much attention we should pay to these kind of things. One, I recall the Dred Scott case from back in the 1800s when a slave was freed by his master and his son came and tried to take him back. He ran to Illinois and he got a Supreme Court case going there. And the Supreme Court turned around and said that African people are not human beings. They are nothing more than property. And property has no rights as a human being. And they could be killed and all kinds of things like that. So I look at that, and then I look at the same court years and years and years later saying it's okay to abort children. So I'm wondering, when we start looking at those things as Noahides, how are we to address this?
All right, fair enough. So I have a few things to say to that. One, by way of a general introduction, being that one of the 7 commandments, in a sense, the 7th, not in order of how they were given by God, but meaning to say, when you list them, so the logical order, this is the 7th and final one, which is the only positive one, as we've discussed many times, is dinim, to set up a court system. That does not mean that they have a right to misinterpret, misunderstand, and misjudge against God's command. So the other 6 and all that branches out of them, that is out of their jurisdiction. So either the mitzvah is commandment for them to uphold the 6 commandments, or to come up with many, many laws as far as other things and civil rights, etc., as long as they don't conflict with the 6. So if, let's say, one easy example would be that they legalize abortion even in the final stage of the pregnancy, it's in the last trimester, and the mother's life is not in danger. And I'm not saying that otherwise they could, I'm just trying to go to the extreme to make it clear where we know that it's forbidden. So in a case where it's absolutely forbidden for any human being to abort their baby, if the court at that time or in that land, for whatever reason, says that it's legal and it's the choice of the mother, pro-choice, then of course we're not allowed to. And anyone who does that is committing this terrible sin and crime. They may be doing it inadvertently, thinking that they're allowed or they're supposed to follow the law of the land, not realizing that as long as that doesn't go against God's law. So that's one thing. And if, let's say, they come out with any other law and they say it is legal and permissible to steal what's clearly considered taking someone else's property without their permission, or any of them. So of course we have to reject it, and depending on the situation, do our best to change that, to protest, to have them fix the law. That's one thing. That doesn't disqualify that court system, in my humble opinion, from being a good system. Just because some of their laws are corrupt, are wrong, and are against the word of God, doesn't mean that what they're saying, which is right and good and correct, or arbitrary and they could do what they want, that we don't listen to them at all. I don't think that's the route to take. We have to be able to clearly make the distinction and know and realize this area, they're completely wrong. And they're accomplices to murder, etc., etc. But that doesn't mean that the judge doesn't have jurisdiction over other areas. Now,
so does that mean he can be corrupt and a judge at the same time, or make corrupt decisions and still be a good judge?
Well, in the case that he's judging, if he's corrupt or if he takes a bribe, which, as I said, would disqualify him, then no, then he's no good, and it's very unfortunate. And practically speaking, you're in a difficult situation, because if you say that you don't have to listen to him, then that just causes chaos. And we have to somehow work from within. But just because he gave a bad ruling or he took a bribe in one case doesn't necessarily, unless the system is good enough, that it will reject him and it will demote him. But otherwise, it's not enough to say that his rulings in other areas are incorrect or are to be ignored. Now, also, you mentioned something, I didn't realize you were that old, that back in the 1800s, with the slaves, and then you're saying it's the same court. It's the same system, not the same people. And even the same people, sometimes they do change their minds, and hopefully in a good way, the concept of teshuvah, of repentance. So just because the American system had something very wrong and corrupt up to a certain point, and then there was a whole turnover, but it's still the same legal system, but now they do it right, that doesn't mean that they're all wrong and they're all bad.
So let's take, for example, the eugenics movement that was going on here in the country, where they were literally doing sterilizations of people all over the country who were poor. And this was like pretty much law for anybody that was on public aid or anything like that. They would do these horrific acts to them. And that was legal, and it had to be challenged so many different ways. But the systems that came from that are still in existence. Like, for example, if I look at Planned Parenthood, in the African American community, there's been over 23 million abortions since 1973. And that's 23 million souls. And when you say when you come after the soul, you're kind of attacking God. They've attacked God 23 million times in our community. And that I find is disturbing. So, but there's a court that stands behind that and says, it's okay for them to do that.
Right. So the question is that court now completely disqualified, and are they evil? And they, for anything that they rule, anything that they say, should we view them like, let's say, the Nazi Party, or do we make a distinction and say they or that system is guilty of 23 million attacks against life and against God? But what they do, which is within the framework of good and lawful, still needs to be respected. That's how you're putting it. So I would hope.
I am oblivious to the idea that they could be one way or the other, because from what I can tell, they go whatever the way the wind blows. And as a Noahide, I don't know if I'm supposed to shift my emphasis every time that wind blows, if it can change at a moment. I guess basically you're saying we should put input, but I mean, it is what it is.
Right, but we need to do whatever we can, whether it's to petition or whatever way we can, to have the various different laws corrected so that they are in line with God's commandments. Not to give up or not to write them off as being wicked and evil, even if they are. But that's the system we have in place. So therefore, we need to somehow fix as much as we can.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Anyone else?
Nick.
Yes. So as a Noahide, you're obligated to pay back your debts. But in our country, we're allowed to file things like bankruptcy to get out of a lot of obligations financially. How does that tie into Noahide law?
That's a good question. Well, is it personal debt from one person to another person that bankruptcy or Chapter 11 or whatever it is erases, or is it more of an organization or a company?
I don't know. What about both instances between a private person and a corporation?
So between a private person and another private person, I would think that you still need to pay the debt. I'm not sure, because it all depends on how it works. Because one can make the argument that being that you're in a certain system and you live in a certain country with certain laws, so when you, let's say, lend the person money in the first place, or whatever the case was, it was with all of these conditions and all of these agreements, all the pages and pages and pages of fine letters that nobody reads, and then you just sign here, you're responsible, you're signing. What did it say over there? At the end of the day, you can't, claim, ignorance or what have you. So if it's built in, and those were the conditions of how you borrowed or lent the money, then I think may work. But otherwise, that would be an example, I guess, of where the law can't override the Noahide law. That if you owe someone money because you either borrowed money or you damaged, then how could the law of the land come and say, well, forfeit? So I'm not sure. It depends on a lot of details and factors.
Thank you.
If the law of the land, if the system has all these allowances within it,
yeah,
and they're doing business within that context,
right,
even if it's not written down, it would still be understood that
Right,
that's,
right.
that's the common practice.
Right, that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
I think that's the case. And I think that would be the situation.
Maybe an ideal person, a pious person might try to, do more than they have to do to pay back the debt.
Right.
But that would be an act of piety.
Yeah.
Aaron.
Okay, so in Chicago right now, they're doing this thing with these community courts, which are kind of like trying to let the people in the community decide what kind of punishment that the person that commits a crime in the community gets, and it's usually something like community service, paying back the people that they've harmed and stuff like that. That's a system that's been set up that's being tested. But I'm curious. The Jewish community has their own courts. Should Noahides try to develop community courts to stay out of the type of courts that you guys won't even walk into?
Okay. So a few things. One, I don't know enough about how that system would work, but let me just tell you about what I do know. The Jewish court system that you're referring to, the Beth Din, is very limited in what they can actually do. Ideally, two law-abiding, Jewish law, religious Jews that have a dispute, they go to the Beth Din, and whatever they rule, they follow. Easier said than done. Because in this country, basically, the way that it works is when the two parties come, the plaintiff and the defendant, they both need to sign a legal document that basically is saying that whatever this rabbi or these rabbis are going to rule, we're accepting as binding, arbitrary, but it's binding legally. So just like anybody can go to somebody who's an arbitrator and both parties say, we want to keep this out of court, but we are accepting that whatever this person rules, and therefore then even if the person rules differently than the law, and in court it would have been different, but because they accepted in advance whatever he's going to say. Now the problem becomes, well, what happens when one party refuses? So I'm not paying you. So what do you mean you signed? Okay, now what do you do? So you end up having to go to court, go to the secular court, in order to uphold the ruling of this arbitrary party. So it's not so simple. In the olden days, the Beth Din had much more power. Going back thousands of years, in the times of the temple, basically, there was capital punishment. No more. That hasn't been the case for 2,000 years. There hasn't been any capital punishment for the Jewish court. Another one, even many years after, was the 39 lashes. There is several hundred of a list out of the 613 commandments, several hundred, the punishment is 39 lashes. Can't do that today either. So basically, all the court can do is rule what the code of Jewish law states. In this case, who owes whom and how much money. But that's it. Now what? So there is not much recourse, and it's very, very sad. And I know firsthand too many stories where they pretty much get to a dead end. And it's very frustrating for the person who won the court case, and he wants his money or what have you. And there's just very limited, I shouldn't say there isn't any recourse, but very limited. So now you're asking, should the Noahides do that? Well, personally, I think it would be a beautiful thing. Maybe I'm too naive. And even after having said this whole introduction of how it works or doesn't exactly work perfectly within the Jewish system nowadays, because people are corrupt, I don't know how well it'll work, but it is definitely worth an attempt. And again, if you have two parties that both of them are, so to say, card-carrying Noahides, well, now they come to this court, and the court gives the ruling, and then it will be legally binding because this was an arbitrator that you signed. That would be beautiful. Why not follow the correct law instead of the law of the land or whatever the court system is going to rule when it may not be God's law? So I think that would be a beautiful thing. I would like to see such a thing, but I'm not sure that it would practically work.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
James Cosno.
James.
Hi, Rabbi Turner. Thanks for taking the question. Why can't, or I shouldn't say why can't, I guess I'm assuming they can't. Let's just throw this out there. What if non-Jewish nations or non-Jewish peoples just use the Torah as the laws for the seven? For instance, a Ben Noach who accidentally kills somebody, it's manslaughter, they're killed outright. But in the Talmud, it talks about how a Ben Noach, or somebody who's keeping the seven, he's accepted by the Jewish community as a ger toshav. He can run to a city of refuge. So what's going on? Like, it's a deep question, but what is the difference? What's going on? And could non-Jews just use the Torah? Because it seems to me like it's kind of making things up without the Torah. Why not just do what the Torah says for the seven?
Right. So some say that in fact, for example, in the Torah portion, next week's Torah portion is Mishpatim, which it starts off with the laws of slaves, a Jewish slave, which we don't have nowadays. And then it goes through all the various civil laws of property damage, etc. And from there, of course, later on, it goes to the later codifiers, to the Rambam, and then ultimately to the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law. So some want to make the argument that the Noahides should follow God's laws. If they're good enough for the Jewish people, well, why not have them follow it? In other words, all of these laws, for example, paying back double. Someone stole, then they have to pay back double. You wanted to make that person lose a value of $100. You stole their item, which was worth $100. So compensation is not just give them 100. Now you have to lose 100. So give them back what you stole, and then you have to, out of your pocket, give them an additional 100. So you have to pay back 200%. That's one example. So some want to say that that is really the way that the Noahides should follow, is all of these laws as we have them, because we're talking about mishpatim. And we know that there are, generally speaking, three types of commandments in the Torah for the Jew. Mishpatim are the type which are logical, which make sense. Now, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be so, but if this is the way that God is telling the Jewish people to conduct themselves financially and interpersonally, so then why not have the Noahides do that as well. And that will make it pretty easy and clear. That just means that you'd be following all of these details of the code of Jewish law when it comes to all those laws. So if you were to have a Noahide court system, they would learn the same laws that a Jewish judge learns. That section in the Shulchan Aruch, out of the 4 sections, it's called Choshen Mishpat, which are the civil laws. Or alternatively, if 2 Noahides have a dispute, they can come to the Jewish court and they can say, we would like to be judged by you. Now, that would be beautiful. I don't think it happens too often that you have 2 non-Jews coming to the Beth Din, but that would be a beautiful scene. And I assume that the judges, the rabbis, would be quite surprised and taken aback and say, why do you want to come to us? Neither of you are Jewish. They say, that's right, we're Noahites. We want to be judged by Torah law. What does the code of Jewish law say? That's what we want to do. And hopefully they would, embrace them. They'd be pretty suspicious. They'd be thinking this is a setup and someone's trying to figure something out and see why they're corrupt or why they're not really, doing their job. But after they get over all that and they realize the sincerity, it would be a beautiful thing. And then the 2 parties sign this document and then they make their claim. I invested this amount of money and this is what happened and he owes me and he was paying, stop payments, the whole thing. And then they rule according to Torah law as if they were 2 Jewish people. That would be beautiful.
I really think that this is what's going to happen because the nations are being brought low and people are losing wisdom and they don't know where to go. And I think what's going to happen is they are going to go to the Torah, even if it's for selfish reasons, like animalistic, I want to save my life type of reason. Kind of like Makos 9a, you have this Ger Toshav that's running. He doesn't want to be killed. And I think that's what's going to happen in the times of Mashiach. People are going to come to Torah through this method.
Yeah, that's for sure. Once we're at that stage now in the beginning of that, but once it's completely, the Messianic era is totally clear and unfolded, for sure. The nations of the world will come flocking, and that will be the law that everybody will be following.
Amen.
One of the challenges, though, is that some of the laws are different between the Jew and the Gentile. That in the court system, the laws of witnesses, the proofs, those are different for Gentiles, and there's a principle that if there are 2 punishments for a crime,
The lesser.
the higher one is done and the lesser one is dropped.
Mhm.
And in the case of someone stealing something, that would be a death penalty for a Noahide,
Right.
and therefore he would be required to repay the principal, but the extra amount that's considered a punishment,
Right.
that he would not apply to a Noahide. So there's a lot of distinction there.
Right. Well, true. And Bob just brought up a very good point, and that is the punishment is very different because we know that as a rule, the punishment for every one of the Noahide commandments of the 7, that is death. That's the penalty. So how does that fit in? They're saying they want to be judged. But again, what I'm suggesting is if it's a civil law where someone says he owes me money and the other one says, no, I don't. So no one was stealing over there, all those cases. Or if someone made a obstacle or a pit, and because of that, the person's animal fell in. So he didn't actually go and steal anything, but because of his actions, this person lost property and so on. So there's many areas and details, but there are differences. Like, do we accept how many witnesses are necessary? So for a Jew, it's one, and it's one case, and for a non-Jew, it's another. And all those details. Is a woman allowed to be a witness, and so on? So obviously, where it's clear that the Noahides have their standards, we'd have to follow that. And then you run into another question: what happens if there's a dispute between a Jew and a Noahide? Then what? And then the Noahide agrees to go to the Jewish court. So, and there's the classical line over there that we tell him that if by Jewish law the Jew, if it would be two Jews, this Jew, this litigant would have the merit, would win the case, then we're going to rule according to Jewish law. If, however, in the secular law, this Jew would win, then we're going to rule like that. So the only way the Noahide in the court can come out victorious and be the winner, if you will, in that case, is if both, according to Torah law and according to the secular law, he's right and the Jew is in the wrong. Then he would be granted victory.
This is my response to what Bob says. So, Dina de Makusa Dina. If a Jewish court has the authority and the power, it's basically Yisrael. It's the land of Yisrael at that point, whether they were they overtook the land or whatever. Now here would be my argument. Non-Jews are not allowed to be in the land unless they would be accepted. Again, this would be in the future, times of Mashiach Yovel. But they would then not just be a Stam ben Noach. They wouldn't be just a plain ben Noach at that point. They would be accepting of the seven. The Beis Din would accept them with the seven, and they would have to be Ger Toshav. This is the laws of in laws of kings and the wars, Hilchot Malachim. Because he's not going to be able to be under a Malchus unless he is at least a Ger Toshav. And we know from like Makos 9a that a Ger Toshav can run to a city of refuge and is offered things like a Ger Toshav. In other words, there's not going to be a Stam ben Noach in Eretz Yisrael at this point, right?
Right.
Would the laws be different though? I mean, as far as the seven laws and the functioning of a court system as it applies to a ben Noach and also to a Ger Toshav, would there be any difference?
Yes, because a ben Noach, at that point, he has to accept the seven as given by the Torah of Moshe. He can't just do the seven because he thinks they're logical, but he would have to do them because of the Torah. He has to accept the Malchus of Yisrael and the Torah, basically. The law of the land would be Yisrael in charge. It would not be the United States of America or some other political entity. So, in other words, a ben Noach would not be under the jurisdiction of a Jewish court, which is how Hilchot Malachim starts with the Sheva Mitzvahs, the seven laws. It's the beautiful captive woman. There's a war that happens. She's captive, and what do we do with her? She has to accept the seven or become, I think, what is it, a Ger Tzedek. So my point is, like, the question's kind of moot because there's not going to be a ben Noach within Eretz Yisrael. He's going to have to be at least a Ger Toshav at that point.
Right, but my question remains, would the law be any different for the Ger Toshav versus a ben Noach? And would the penalties and the functioning of the court system be any different?
Yes, and Makos 9a, running to a city, it talks about running to a city of refuge. somebody hits somebody on the head, it talks about a Yisrael hitting a Yisrael. Then it talks about a Ger Toshav hitting a Yisrael. And then it talks about a Ger Toshav hitting a Ger Toshav. And like, what is that? What are those different interactions? And what's interesting there is because a Ger Toshav hitting another Ger Toshav, he is granted the ability to run to a city of refuge. However, a Stam ben Noach, a plain ben Noach, who has not accepted the Torah, outside, they're in a different kingdom, so to speak. They have to be killed outright for manslaughter.
So you're saying that based on this, on the case of the whole sugya, the discussion of Arei Miklat, of cities of refuge, that therefore Ger Toshav is not the same penalty or punishment as a Ben Noach.
Correct. And
if a Ger Toshav steals, would he be Chayiv Misa? Would he get the capital punishment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would I only did the research on manslaughter for Makos 9a, but I would think it would have something to do with the din of Yisrael just for those 7. That's me just saying that. I don't know, but it's definitely, if Makos 9a talks about manslaughter being different, then it very well could be different for
let's say when it comes to Avodah Zarah, so for a Jew, for Yisrael, Shituf is completely considered Avodah Zarah, right?
Oh, yes. And we know that the Rebbe says that a Ger Toshav is different. So in the times of Mashiach, there's going to be the borders of Israel are going to expand, God willing. There are going to be non-Jews that are going to be flocking to Israel. They are going to have to get rid of Shituf. And I think the Rebbe talks about this. Why are the 6? Why does it say Ger Toshav and a Surei Bia doesn't do? He excludes Avodah Zarah, and then he says the other 6, and then the Rebbe talks about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but Shituf also is, in order to be a pious among the nations, which is, the Ger Toshav outside of Israel.
Okay.
In order to be one of the pious of the nations, you would have to also forego Shituf. So that also applies to Noahide today. Well,
I mean, the Rebbe, I think it's in this week's Parsha, in Parshas Yisro, is where he talks about it. What is a Stam ben Noach? In other words, there are non-Jews who do the 7 because they just logically feel like they're the right things to do, or some other reason besides the Torah. But there are certain that do it because of the Torah. And let's just be safe here, and let's say they are Ger Toshav, they are accepted by a base din. It's Yovel year. So let's just say theoretically, just to keep it more kosher, right? So the Rebbe, I'm pretty sure the Rebbe says, what is the distinction between these different 2 types of non-Jews that are doing the 7, but they are accepting them differently? One's from the Torah and one's not from the Torah. And he says that one of the differences is he accepts lo avodah zarah like a Yisrael, and he gives up shituf explicitly.
Correct, and that is all the people that, basically the people that call themselves Noahides today. That would include the people that call themselves Ger Toshav today. The people that are kind of listening to the rabbis and kind of signing up with the program. Those people would be not following shituf. They would not be following the partnership thing. They would be purely monotheist.
Right. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. There's a difference there.
Yeah. Okay, but that wouldn't really apply to the court system though. Okay. It's pretty good.
So one more thing. Let's say Avram Minachai. So if a Jew were to eat non-kosher, the court would not put him to death. But what happens if a ger toshav eats Aver min achai, part of a living animal? So because he's now on the higher level of ger toshav and he's accepted the sovereignty of the Jewish people, etc., would he now not be put to death because he's not a regular Noahide?
That's an interesting question. I'd like to see a sage or a Torah source from that. And that's a good point.
All right.
Let me know if you find it.
Okay.
These are great questions.
Very good. So we're looking at next week.
Next week, chapter 4, you're opening up a different
No,
book.
no.
Okay, yeah, chapter 4, society, social policy, and the Noahide laws. And we're looking at next week.
Yes, no question between other page 81 for next week. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. All the best, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night.